Welcome to Ballot Battleground, Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Margiott, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. It's mail time here at the Ballot Battleground Nevada studio. We put out a call for listener questions last week all over social media, and you guys came up with some good ones. So we've got a great episode for you guys this week, digging through the mailbag with special guest Chris Murphy. If you watch our morning show on News 4 and Fox 11, you know him well. We wanted to bring him on to help facilitate this first mailbag episode. It was so fun answering all your questions with Chris. I think you're going to love this week's show. I am so pleased to be joined now by my colleague, Chris Murphy, making the long trip from Studio A here to the Ballot Battleground Nevada studio. We appreciate it.
I'm out of breath. It was a long journey to get here.
For our listeners and viewers, I mean, it's about 20 feet, maybe 50 feet from the desk, but we appreciate it nonetheless.
I'm going to say 30. It's
Okay.
not bad.
Yeah.
Though. I'm honored. So what number podcast is this?
This is number 13, I believe.
Lucky
So,
13.
The luckiest number.
Thanks
and
for asking.
That's why it's going to be the best show yet.
Well, thanks for asking me. Evidently, though, and Madison said this over in Studio A this morning when we recorded this Tuesday morning,
Sure.
that she actually implored you to have me do this segment. So thanks really to Madison.
A special thanks to Maddie and a special thanks to Chris for agreeing to it after, for our listeners who don't watch, they should be watching, News 4 Today and mornings on Fox 11, 4 hours of morning news every single day. He does a great job and also very knowledgeable about politics as well. He's been interviewing me about the show weekly to kind of promote the podcast. So we figured he'd be great to kind of stand in as our listeners for this listener mailbag episode.
I love that you're doing this. So the response as we've looked over these is really interesting, Ben. You're the expert on covering state politics here. And that's why I'm so glad that you've launched Ballot Battleground Nevada as we're here in this election year. And you get all kinds of comments on Reddit, Twitter, or X now.
Yeah, we got a great response from people. We put out the call on social media all over the place, Facebook, Instagram. We got a bunch, probably more than we'll be able to get to today. But I think we have a good batch of questions. We're going to get to as many as we possibly can. And then I'll plug for listeners to keep submitting your questions routinely to me, to Chris, email us, because hopefully we'll be doing this from time to time, answering your questions, because I think it's a fun way to interact with the listeners and get some answers to questions that people are thinking about.
Let's jump right in.
Yeah.
So the first question here, and this is from Envy Election Forum. That is their X handle, formerly known as Twitter. And they say, how about Greg Kidd, nonpartisan candidate for Congressional District number 2? That's Mark Amadei's district.
Yep.
No Democratic candidate threw his or her hat in the ring, Ben.
Yeah.
But 62% of Congressional District 2 is not GOP.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting race, Mark Amadei's race.
Super interesting dynamic and a great question from Nevadans for Election Reform. Doug Goodman, a previous guest or future guest on the show. He was a guest on a pilot episode that didn't get to air, and we'll bring him back as a future guest. But a great question, because we did that episode a few weeks ago with Mark Amadei and Fred Simon, the Republican candidates for Northern Nevada's Congressional District 2. And I said in that episode that the winner of that primary, the GOP primary, would likely go on to win the seat because there's no Democratic candidate. Doug and Nevadans for Election Reform pointing out here that there's a nonpartisan candidate. His name is Greg Kidd, and who knows, because there is no Democratic candidate, and it seems like from doing some research on this Greg Kidd candidate that he's going to try and appeal to independents, which are or nonpartisans, I should say, a huge portion of the electorate, as well as Democrats.
Well, and Mark Amadei, the incumbent, the GOP, of course, he's been there forever, right? How many years now?
I think 10 to 12 years at least. And so it's always an uphill climb to try and unseat an incumbent, especially someone that's been in office for that long.
Entrenched.
But this is an interesting dynamic. If there was ever to be an upset, maybe it's this scenario where this Greg Kidd candidate can appeal to the large group of Democrats and the large group of nonpartisans.
So if he wins, people will be asking, who is this kid? Dad joke of the day. I apologize.
But I will say too, because
yeah.
I was doing some research on him, and we'll probably interview him and bring him on at some point because voters deserve to know more. He's already advanced, through to the general because there's no primary for this lone nonpartisan candidate. So we won't talk to him for the primary, but in the general, he's an entrepreneur. So presumably he's going to have a lot of money to maybe self-fund or be able to fundraise a decent amount of money. And according to a polling memo I saw on his website, his plan is to kind of consolidate Democrats and independent voters around the issue of women's reproductive freedom and other personal liberties. And as we ran last week, he was actually at the Jackie Rosen event last Friday where they were signing the petition for the abortion ballot question. He was at that event. So, nonpartisan, but still aligning with the Democrats on this issue of abortion rights.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what abortion rights do for the general election as well. We know it was a big deal for the midterms. That ruling had just come out by the Supreme Court. We'll see how it plays in the state congressional races for sure. All right, second question.
Yep.
This is from Derwin on Reddit. Now, Derwin, I think, was asking a question about the question, saying, what issue do you differ from your party stance and why? I think, Ben, he's maybe asking of you, the podcaster, to ask that of your guests.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. The reason we wanted to include it today, what issue do you differ from your party stance and why? I think it can be revealing about where a candidate feels or how a candidate feels about a certain issue. And so I'll use it as a chance to promote. We're doing a ton of candidate interviews here in the next 10 to 12 days. Okay. We've created a massive spreadsheet where we've reached out to dozens of primary candidates. We're going to be bringing them in here to the News 4 studios in the coming weeks. And I think it could be a very illuminating question. So I'm really glad that Derwin asked that question on Reddit. And we'll try and ask it of the candidates here. So stay tuned for those interviews to see their responses.
All right. Next question comes from Thanos, Hands of Fate on Reddit, asking, how has Sam Brown's stance on Yucca Mountain changed? Is Yucca still effectively a non-starter among other prospective Nevada politicians?
Yeah, and so we got this question, I believe, this morning because there was an LA Times story that just came out about Yucca Mountain. For those listeners who might not know, a proposed nuclear waste repository in southern Nevada. I believe it's about 100 miles or so north of Las Vegas. There's been some preliminary work done down there, but it has never been operational. It's where the federal government ultimately maybe one day would like to store spent nuclear waste.
Nuclear fuel rods, yeah.
Right, and it's been opposed, dating back to the Harry Reid years for decades now. And Chris, you would know more about opposition dating back to...
Yeah, when I used to work over at Channel 2 and did that show Face the State, which is still on, it's been on long before I did it in the late 90s. Harry Reid and, at the time, Senator Richard Bryan, both Democrats representing Nevada, were very concerned about it and fought it viciously back there in Washington, D.C. And here we are, Ben. It's interesting for me to sit here 25 years later and still talk about Yucca Mountain.
Yeah, no, because there are still efforts, by some in the federal government. They see it as an opportunity, but it's been so broadly opposed in Nevada from members of both parties, Mark Amadei, former Governor Brian Sandoval, Nevada Senators Jackie Rosen, Catherine Cortez Masto. You go down the list. I think virtually every elected politician in this state is opposed to storing nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain. But this week, the LA Times reporting that in recent years, as recently as 2022, Sam Brown supported opening the facility, calling the failure to open it, and I'm reading here from the LA Times story, quote, an incredible loss of revenue for our state. And so that's kind of... he's separated himself with those comments because as far as I've seen, and I could be wrong, listeners ask us a question or point out to us if that's the case. I haven't seen any other candidates in this Republican Senate primary or even on the Democratic side that have shown support
for storing it there.
For storing nuclear
and
waste.
And that's a bold move.
Yeah. I mean, especially it's, again, opposed by virtually everyone here. And when they asked him, the LA Times did, about whether his remarks represented his current views about Yucca Mountain, he didn't specifically respond to that, but provided a statement essentially saying, I'm always interested in economic opportunities for Nevada. But he did not
declaratively state, I'm on the side of storing it here for the money.
Right. But he did not state or say the opposite.
Isn't that typical of an election year, right? There's some equivocation.
For sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. So that was an interesting response from him. He did not say that he was opposed. He did not necessarily say he was supportive, but Democrats, Jackie Rosen and others will be pouncing on this as they already have. I saw emails in my inbox this morning to that effect.
All right, speaking of Jackie Rosen, and this is interesting too when you talk about going against the party grain. Question here from CY on Reddit asking Ben, how can Jackie Rosen claim to be the most bipartisan senator ever when she votes with Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer 99% of the time?
Yeah, it's a good question. And Harold P. actually jumped in the comments. Appreciate him. He did a little research for me, but it's basically we are referencing the 538 tracker, which essentially says, does your member of Congress vote with or against Biden? How often? And so Jackie Rosen has voted with President Biden 92.5% of the time. That's a tie with Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, both of them voting with Biden over 92% of the time. That actually puts them essentially close to being the most bipartisan Democratic senators in the upper chamber right now. I could show you the little chart here, Chris, but they are right in the middle in terms of how often they're voting with Biden. 92.5% of the time, you would think that that's an vastly
supportive of Biden?
Supportive of Biden, but compared to their other Democratic senators, that is
they're closer to 100%.
Right. Yeah. Many of them are 100, 99, 98%. So they're actually closer.
It makes me wonder, Ben, what is the other 7.5% that they didn't vote with Biden?
Right. Yeah.
I'd love to know those issues.
For sure. And for comparison to Nevada's congressional Democrats in the House, Stephen Horsford, Susie Lee, Dina Titus, all hailing out of Southern Nevada, they voted with Biden 100% of the time. So Jackie Rosen and Cortez Masto definitely differing from Biden far more than many of their other Democratic colleagues.
Interesting. Okay, the Redstone Scout on Reddit asked this question, abortion on the ballot, okay? There's a lot of questions about that, and you mentioned Jackie Rosen being in town last week. Yeah. She was here to sign a petition. What is she pushing for? Where does this all stand?
Yeah, so Nevadans for Reproductive Freedom had put forward 2 ballot questions dealing with reproductive freedom. I won't go super in depth on the differences between the two because ultimately after the legal battles, both were allowed to be on the ballot, but Nevadans for Reproductive Freedom, these advocates have chosen to go with a narrower question that asks voters, should abortion be in the Nevada Constitution? The other question essentially had to deal with a handful of reproductive freedoms, IVF, vasectomy, prenatal care, postpartum care, all of those. But the one that they are gathering signatures for now, and as of last week, they had more than enough signatures to qualify, so it should be on the ballot. Should abortion be in the Nevada Constitution? There's some misconceptions out there. The Redstone Scout commented, I thought it already was in the Constitution. That is a common misconception that we addressed in a recent episode of the podcast, but I'll restate it here. It's in Nevada law right now, thanks to a 1990 referendum that passed. I don't know if were you at Channel 2 at the time?
No, they're 97 to 2000.
Gotcha.
So long before my time, 1990.
Yeah, well over 30 years ago that this referendum passed by almost like a 2/3 margin. And it put abortion rights into state law. It can be repealed by one vote of the people. This effort that's going to likely be on the ballot in 2024 wants to put those same abortion rights, or very similar, in the Nevada Constitution. It would need to pass twice, but then if it is in the Constitution, it would take 2 votes of the people in consecutive elections to be overturned. Yeah. So in state law now, if it goes in the Constitution, requires yet another vote of the people to be overturned and repealed.
That seems like ancient history now. 1990, Reagan had only been out of office 2 years. George Herbert Walker Bush 41 was the president in the middle of his term, one and only.
Yeah, not to age you, but that was 4 years before I was born.
Let's see. I was a junior in college. There you go. All right, next question comes from Accomplished Legs 722 on Reddit. Oh, by the way, speaking of legs, you trained for the Reno the race, the 10K and the 5K last weekend.
Half marathon, not to.
And how'd you did a half marathon?
Did a half marathon with our producer Aiden, who produces one of our morning shows.
Our 7 a.m. hour. How did it go?
great. Honestly,
Did you and
great
Aiden
race.
finish like in the top 25 or 30?
We were like the top 59th and 60th, I think, out of 440 some half marathoners.
Your lovely wife, Kenzie, must be so proud of her husband.
She is always, but especially so when she sees me,
Running. She's
sprinting
like,
there
wow,
at the end.
my
to
man's
make up
in
some
shape.
Extra time.
I'm so proud of you. I can't run anymore. It's too painful. All right. So next question. Good job, Ben. This is from Accomplished Legs 722. I was wondering why I brought that up. That was the leg thing. So the question here is, when the government vetoed a bill, but the majority in Carson City, the governor, I should say. Thank you. By the way, has the governor taken you up to be a member of the podcast, Jeff? Where's Lombardo? Are we getting him on?
That's actually a great segue, and I'll mention it again because, we have reached out a handful of times, 3 or 4, I think. Don't want to say exactly, but several times now to get him on the podcast. And
you know what? We're going to start a chant.
It hasn't happened yet.
Let's go, Joe. Let's go, Joe. Okay. When the governor vetoed a bill, but the majority in Carson City passed both sides, will it remain idle until the next session, or has to go through the gambit again? Is the bill at this point, does it have a chance basically to be overridden, I think is what they're trying to say.
Yeah, so I don't know if they're referring to a specific bill or not, but Governor Lombardo vetoed, I believe it was 75 bills in the 2023 legislative session, which was an all-time record, shattering the prior record.
So the dynamic here is that the legislature leans Democratic, and he is the basically bully pulpit there in the governor's mansion as a Republican governor, right?
Exactly, yeah. So the Democrats that have control or had control in the last session of the Assembly and the Senate, they're sending him tons of bills, hundreds of bills, and many of them sending these bills to his office, probably expecting them to get vetoed.
To make a statement politically?
Perhaps, yeah, because some of them, they probably expect a veto, but they want to be able to say to their voters, hey, we tried. We passed this bill. We sent it to the governor, and he vetoed it. So 75 total vetoes, but this person is asking what happens, how does that veto get overturned? And so essentially nothing can happen in this interim, which is the period between legislative sessions, which in Nevada only happen every other year, unless there were to be a special session, which doesn't look like that's happening right now. The bills that he did veto, those 75, they will come back. They're resurrected in the next legislative session, the regular session, which will be 2025 next year. And then it would need to get a 2/3 vote in both houses to override the governor's veto. And that is why the stakes are so high for these Nevada legislature elections, because Democrats have a supermajority already in the Assembly. They're one vote away from a supermajority in the Senate. If they flip that one seat in the Senate, hold their numbers in the Assembly, they'll have double supermajorities. They can override anything the governor has vetoed. They can pass tax increases or tax breaks or whatever, essentially without any approval from the governor.
And that'll be fascinating, because then the governor really has lost a lot of his efficacy and strength. So he'll be paying very close attention to November 5th.
Yeah, John Ralston, the CEO of the Nevada Independent, great line when we had him on the show recently. He said the governor might as well go to Cancun.
Yeah,
if they lose it, because he can't veto anything.
Have you ever been to Cancun?
No. Have you?
I don't think I have. No. I say I don't think I have. That's sad.
Right.
I've been to Mexico. Can't remember.
Many Mexico trips.
Dang, that reminds me. I need to book another trip. All right. So here's an interesting inside baseball question. This is from Jackson R76 on Reddit, Ben. He says, hi, Ben. Quick question about your new podcast. Is this podcast, again, Ballot Battleground, Nevada, affiliated with Sinclair? That's our parent company. I'm just wondering if you have complete autonomy over this content, or if this is an arm of News 4/Fox 11.
It's a great question, Jackson R76, and we appreciate it. I replied on Reddit because this question was a few months ago, but wanted to address it again here for our listeners. This show, in terms of the editorial decisions, the content that's on the show, all of that is decided at a local level between myself and producer, news director. The content, the topics, the questions, that is all decided on a local level. Of course, our parent company is Sinclair Broadcast Group. If you look in the bottom of the show description, they have the copyright, and there is a team at Sinclair Broadcast Group that's been very helpful when it comes to production quality. I was learning how to actually record a podcast. This team helped design the logo and help with a lot of the back end stuff. They've been very helpful along those lines. But in terms of the content topics, questions, guests. They have no influence over that, and we have autonomy over the content of the show here at the local level.
So they won't be upset that I brought up your prowess in half marathons.
Okay.
No, but that also leads me to ask you another question. I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but Sinclair has several TV stations spread out all across the country.
Yeah.
They're headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland, and they have affiliates. Here we're NBC, we're Fox 11, and we're NSN, Nevada Sports Net.
Right.
Are they encouraging reporters and anchors in the other TV markets to start podcasts like this one?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a big push for the company right now as we're trying to expand onto the platforms where people are getting their content, whether it be politics, whether it be news of the day or sports. I mean, a lot of our stations that are in professional sports markets, they have, podcasts focused specifically on that team, and they're talking about the Baltimore Orioles a couple times a week or what have you. I believe our sister station in Salt Lake City has a news and politics focused show that I've listened to a couple times.
Who are your teams?
My teams, San Francisco Giants, Las Vegas Raiders, and Arizona State University Sun Devils, Sacramento Kings as well, because I hail from Sacramento, California.
Cronkite School of Journalism?
Yeah, Walter Cronkite School of Journalism.
Love that. I love
Who
that.
are your teams, Chris?
My teams, so grew up in Boston as a little kid, so I was a Red Sox fan. But then we moved, when I was 8, we moved to Los Angeles. So I became sort of a Dodgers fan.
Yeah, gross.
I know. Celtics in basketball.
Ew.
Eagles in football, because I lived in Philly for 3 years and got to know a lot of the guys and the coach Doug Peterson at the time. And Vince Papale, actually lived with Vince. The movie Invincible was made about him with Mark Wahlberg. So I got to know Vince.
And
so
I met Mark Wahlberg at the Nevada legislature.
Yeah, so. Interesting. He's pushing to get movies made here in Nevada, right?
He is, yeah. That bill ended up dying in the legislative process. I think some form of that bill could be coming back in 2025.
Oh, when are you getting Jeremy Renner on the show? He lives right in our viewing area.
That's a great question.
Come on, Lombardo and Renner together. Let's talk about the next question, okay? We mentioned your lovely wife, Kenzie. How effective do you think campaign signs are, she asks, on X?
Yeah, I love
and
this
by the
question.
way, I'm so sick of saying X.
Yeah.
How do you X someone? Let me X. It's tweet. Twitter and tweet. That was the one left turn that Elon made that I didn't like when he rebranded.
We can just call it Twitter here. As I mentioned, we have autonomy to talk about what we want here. So on this show, we can call it Twitter.
That's great. I'm coming back for your next podcast then. So Kenzie asks, how effective do you think campaign signs are? Boy, I'll tell you, I live out in Wingfield Springs, and I'll go from where I live out to Red Hawk and Golf.
Yeah.
My goodness, Vista's littered with them.
That is a common area. Yeah, I see them there all the time too.
Yeah.
And it's that time of year. Kenzie jokes that she is allergic to the blooming campaign signs that start to pop up in March and April. They're all over the place, and she wants to know, do they actually work, or is it just kind of a
Have
show
there studies
of
been done on that? The
That
efficacy of them?
That is the rabbit hole that I went down in preparation to answer this question. As it happens, I was listening to a different podcast, which we'll link to in the show notes, called Search Engine. They interviewed a researcher that looked into this several years ago. Essentially, bottom line, they found that signs can make a difference somewhere between 1 and 2 percentage points on average.
1 or 2 percentage
Not
points.
a ton, but if a tight race, that could be the deciding factor. So they did an experiment. You're going to love this, Chris, where essentially they put up, this was a different study, but in 2011, they put up yard signs for a fictitious city council candidate.
Okay.
Great name, Ben, but it's Ben Griffin. And they put all these signs up for handful of real candidates as well as this fake candidate, Ben Griffin. And they did a study. They circled back with, I don't know how many, probably a couple hundred respondents after these fake and real signs had been up for some time. And believe it or not, nearly a quarter of respondents, when they were asked to rank these candidates, how they would vote for them, picked the fake guy, Ben Griffin, among their top 3 picks.
What's such an honest sounding name, right?
They didn't want it to be so too common, like say Mike Brown, but they didn't want it to be such an unusual name.
Yeah.
And sure enough, this fake guy did not exist. No campaign website, no face to the name, but 3/4, or let's see, I got it up here. Yeah, a quarter of respondents said that he was among their top 3 picks for the city council seat.
You mentioned my time over at Channel 2 in the late 90s. At the time, it was Mayor Griffin. So there you go.
Yeah.
Ben Franklin,
They
just
can
a likable
work.
name.
And the effect, I think this is fascinating. I might have to do a separate episode entirely on this. essentially just by us driving past, seeing the sign out of the corner of our eye, we can ingest that information without even realizing it, essentially. And then you see this sign over and over every single day, a couple of times. You, in your mind, think of that as a legitimate person, a legitimate candidate, just by virtue of seeing that sign and doing no other research on that person.
Yeah, because obviously you're driving by a sign. There's no way you learn anything about the candidate.
Right, yeah. And it's unfortunate, but most people aren't doing hours of research on their city council candidates. They should be following our coverage, of course, but oftentimes people aren't, especially for these lower level races. Yeah.
You know what we're busy doing? We're busy raising kids oftentimes. And speaking of kids, you have a lovely son, Sage, who, by the way,
great Nevada name, if I say so
come
myself.
on, it's the state flower, sagebrush, right? And you have something to share. At least Riley Schneider on X said, "Can Rhett go on the podcast?" Now, who is Rhett?
Rhett is Riley and Michelle's son. So they're both editors at the Nevada Independent.
Okay.
And he wants to know, Rhett and Sage are about the same age, I believe, only separated by a couple of months. And I replied and I said, yeah, Rhett and Sage joined the pod to rant about what it's like to have parents in journalism.
I love it.
Yeah. Because there are many inconveniences of, my wife was a journalist, Riley, Michelle, both journalists. Sometimes it's inconvenient. We got long hours, hard hours in the middle of the night, writing stories. And Rhett and Sage,
We're out of questions, but I have one more question.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So when you look at little Sage, right, when you think of careers, you mentioned your wife and your careers, what do you think Sage will be when he grows up?
Oh my gosh.
If you could predict right here,
yeah,
the last couple days of April, the last day of April that we're recording this, 2024, and he's what, almost 2?
He's almost 2, yeah.
Based on what you've experienced in the last 23 months, 24 months.
I would probably have to say truck driver just because he's, or farmer because he loves playing with his tractors.
Listen, it's all going to be autonomous Tesla trucks by then, right?
That's true, yeah. Sage, if you're listening, learn how to code or something. And I'd be honored if he went into journalism, but we don't make a lot of money. So I'd tell him, if you want, go code or something.
Let's say he's an amazing shortstop and he gets drafted in the big leagues.
Sure.
Would you rather him play for the Atlanta Braves or the San Francisco Giants?
Easy question. Obviously, Giants, as my team, as Kenzie listens in and is cheering for the Braves here. But he probably can't play shortstop because he's very left-hand dominant right now.
Okay.
Can't be a lefty playing it short, but there's time for him to learn how to throw righty too.
Well, thank you for inviting me to share this time with you.
It's been such a pleasure, Chris. We went down many directions that I didn't anticipate. Yeah. And that's always the fun of bringing you on to chat.
That's
great.
what we do.
And no time limit. That's the best part too. We could chat about whatever for however long we want.
Oh, good. I got a few more questions. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Thanks,
Appreciate it, Chris. We'll have you back sometime.
Can't wait.
Always great chatting with Chris. A special thanks to him for making time to come on this week. If we didn't answer your question, we will try to get to it next time, so keep them coming. I'm not sure how often we'll get the chance to answer questions, but if you have something you want us to talk about, tag me or News4 on social media, on Facebook, X, Instagram, or send me an email. My email is bjmargiott, Margiott, at sbgtv.com. Just make sure to put Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. You can also send your comments, compliments, and concerns to that email as well. If you like the show, it would mean a lot to me if you rated it and wrote a quick review. That helps the podcast show up higher in searches so more people can discover us. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.